Okay, so, when we talk about the Harlem Renaissance, we instantly think about all that amazing art and the literature, the music. But what might surprise you as a fellow philosophy enthusiast is that all that creative energy was actually deeply influenced by a philosopher.
Oh, wow.
Alain Locke, often called the father of the Harlem Renaissance. So we have a philosopher shaping an artistic movement.
Mm.
I mean, that's pretty fascinating, right?
It is, yeah. And what's immediately striking is the sheer philosophical depth of Locke's work. I mean, while the New Negro is obviously super important in cultural studies today, we're going to be zeroing in on his systematic philosophical framework, his theories of value, his take on pluralism and relativism, his ideas on aesthetics, and of course his groundbreaking work in the philosophy of race. So basically we're going to be uncovering the core philosophical ideas that shaped his views on art and culture. Yeah.
Exactly. And our main source for this deep dive is going to be the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Locke, which is like a really detailed overview of his intellectual life. And we're going to try to pick out the most philosophically interesting ideas, the ones that will really resonate with you as someone who's also grappling with these big questions, because beyond his impact on the Harlem Renaissance, Locke was a serious and creative philosopher with fully developed theories in lots of different areas of philosophy.
Yeah, and that's a really important point to remember. We're not just looking at Locke, the cultural figure, but Locke, the philosopher. And a good place to start is with his value theory, or as some people call it, axiology. So Locke was really wrestling with this problem that I'm sure many of you listening have thought about too. How do we justify our values and moral principles without falling into rigid dogmatism, or on the flip side, just saying everything is relative? I mean, it's a classic meta-ethical dilemma with some pretty big real-world consequences.
Yeah, totally. And Locke's approach to this is pretty unique. So he says that values aren't these abstract things that exist apart from human experience. Instead, he thinks they're deeply embedded in our attitudes.
Mm-hmm.
We basically experience them through our feelings. And he even came up with these terms, feeling quality and value modes, suggesting that the specific way we feel about something actually determines the type of value we're dealing with, whether it's aesthetic like beauty, or moral like goodness, or religious like sacredness, or even logical like consistency.
Right, think about it the feeling of awe you might get in a cathedral is totally different from the feeling of aha, you get when you solve a tough logic puzzle, right? Those are different feeling qualities.
Yeah, I get it, and that makes total sense.
So he's saying there's this intrinsic connection between a specific feeling quality and its corresponding value mode. So our gut emotional response to something basically tells us what category of value it falls into. And the cool thing is that he's not trying to figure these categories out through pure reason or logic. He's actually looking at how people actually value things in their lives and using that to build his theory.
So instead of imposing these preset categories on values, he's actually observing how we value things in real life and then working backwards from there, which is a pretty empirical approach, right?
It is, and it leads him to what he calls a functional view of values.
So what exactly does that mean for someone who's, trying to figure out what values are all about?
So for Locke, the power or the validity of values doesn't come from some outside source or some higher realm. It actually comes from the specific role those values play in a particular culture. He sees them as stereotypes of feeling attitudes and habitual impulses towards certain choices of actions. And this brings in a really strong pragmatic element to his theory of value. So basically, the worth of a value depends on how well it works in a given social and historical context, not on some timeless universal truth.
And this leads us to his idea of transvaluation, which is really interesting, especially if you're used to thinking about moral or aesthetic principles as fixed and unchanging.
Yeah, transvaluation is basically the process where we start valuing the same thing in a totally different way because our feelings about it have changed. And Locke argues that this isn't just a possibility, it's actually inevitable because of how much societies and cultures change all the time. Something we once cherished might end up evoking different emotions down the line because of new experiences or, just how society evolves. And as a result, its value for us changes completely.
Think about how people's views on certain technologies have changed over time. Right? Something that was once cutting edge can become obsolete or even harmful, or the other way around, right? Something that was dismissed might become super valuable later on.
Exactly. And Locke also gives us this really cool taxonomy of values, a way of categorizing these different value modes.
So how does that work?
Well, he identifies four main categories: religious, moral, logical, and aesthetic. And for each of these, he defines the corresponding modal quality, that basic feeling we were talking about, along with some typical descriptions, and whether the value tends to be focused inwards on the individual or outwards towards society. So, for example, with religious values, the core feeling is exaltation. Some typical descriptions might be holy or unholy, and it can be expressed both internally as like spiritual ecstasy or externally as acts of devotion.
It's like a map of the different ways we experience value. And Locke says that by basing values on these fundamental feeling qualities, his theory actually has some advantages over theories that are based purely on logic or reason, especially when you're trying to explain things like transvaluation or how different types of values can overlap or clash.
Right, because logical theories run into trouble when we do things like describe a mathematical proof as beautiful. I mean, we're using a term from aesthetics to describe something that's usually considered purely logical. But Locke's theory can handle this kind of thing really well because it focuses on the underlying emotional experience. So instead of seeing it as a logical contradiction, it interprets it as a shift or tension between different mental states.
Okay, so we've got this picture of values as dynamic, context-dependent, and basically rooted in our emotions. But now let's talk about another big part of Locke's philosophy, pluralism, given his involvement in the Harlem Renaissance. It makes sense that he'd be interested in diversity and how to deal with it.
Absolutely. Locke saw diversity in all its forms, religious, cultural, and even in terms of values themselves, as like a fundamental part of being human. So his goal was to figure out how different groups interact and how we can encourage positive engagement between them. And he identifies three main things that get in the way of a truly pluralistic outlook.
And those are absolutism, uniformitarianism, and arbitrary dogmatism.
Yeah.
So let's break those down a bit for our philosophy-minded listeners. So absolutism, if I understand it correctly, is the idea that certain values and principles are universally true, no matter the context or culture.
Yeah, exactly. And Locke argues that absolutist views often get their authority from sources that are outside of human experience, like religious dogma or abstract rational principles, instead of being based on how people actually live their lives. This tendency to universalize things goes against the whole idea of pluralism, which is about accepting and accommodating a wide range of different values.
And then we have uniformitarianism, which is the belief that everyone within a certain group or society should have the same values, often leading to the suppression of diversity in the name of unity or cohesion.
Right, this drive for sameness, whether it's enforced through like rules or just social pressure, tries to eliminate the many different ways values can be expressed, which Locke sees as essential for a pluralistic society. He believed that this desire for uniformity often comes from a need to strengthen a group's identity or create a sense of agreement, but it can quickly turn into forcing one particular set of values onto everyone else.
And lastly, we have arbitrary dogmatism, which is basically clinging to certain values without any real justification and refusing to even consider other viewpoints or update your beliefs when you get new information.
That's the third barrier to pluralism for Locke, because he thinks that true pluralism requires being open to questioning your own values and being willing to seriously engage with different perspectives. If we just dig in our heels and refuse to consider other points of view, there's no way we can create a truly pluralistic environment.
So assuming we can avoid these philosophical traps, how does Locke see pluralism working in the real world? He talks about it as a functional base for finding common ground between value systems that seem to clash.
And what's really insightful here is that he's not trying to create some grand universal value system that everyone has to follow. Instead, he's looking for shared features and functional equivalences between different value systems. He talks about basic human values, things like believing in something bigger than ourselves, the importance of community and respecting life. And he's not saying these are universal rules, but rather values that are expressed in different ways across many different cultures.
So it's not that everyone values the exact same things in the exact same way, but that we can see similarities in the types of things that people value across cultures. And his distinction between basic equivalence and functional constancy is helpful for understanding this subtle but important point.
Right, basic equivalence refers to a shared form or structure in values that underlying value mode, even if the specific object or practice that's being valued is different. Functional constancy, on the other hand, is about how a value serves a similar purpose in different communities, even if it looks different on the surface. The example of marriage is really helpful here. Marriage rituals and beliefs can be totally different from culture to culture, but they often serve similar functions when it comes to things like family raising kids and social organization.
It's about finding those basic points of connection and shared purpose that exist beneath all the cultural differences. And this lays the groundwork for his theory of relativism, which, as you mentioned earlier, he sees not as a way of saying all values are equal or meaningless, but as a positive affirmation of different cultural traditions and value systems.
It's exactly. Locke relativism isn't about saying that nothing matters or that we can't tell right from wrong. It's about recognizing the inherent worth of different cultures and understanding them within their specific historical and social contexts. And he has these 3 principles of cultural relativism that are really important for how we approach understanding different cultures.
Those are cultural equivalence, cultural reciprocity, and cultural convertibility. So starting with cultural equivalence, it's about looking beyond the surface differences between cultures to find those underlying functional similarities, those things he calls culture cognates or culture correlates.
Yeah, Locke wants us to actively search for those similarities, to really dig deep and find the objective common ground that exists beneath all the surface level cultural differences. And he sees this as the foundation for understanding communication and cooperation between cultures. It's about recognizing that different cultures might be achieving the same basic human goals, even if they're doing it in different ways. Like, think about storytelling, for example. Different cultures have their own unique ways of telling stories, but often those stories serve similar functions, like passing down cultural values and history.
And then there's cultural reciprocity, which emphasizes how cultures influence and learn from each other and rejects the idea that any culture is inherently superior or inferior.
Right. Locke advocates for what he calls beneficent neutrality, which is basically an attitude of openness and respect that leads to tolerance, understanding, and ultimately a two-way exchange between different cultural groups. So instead of making these sweeping judgments about entire cultures as being better or worse, he says we should make careful point-by-point comparisons to figure out if there are any specific areas where one culture might be stronger or weaker than another. This way we avoid those really simplistic and often harmful labels that say one whole culture is better than another.
And finally, we have cultural convertibility, which is about how cultural elements are borrowed and integrated between different societies. And Locke points out that this process is usually selective, meaning that the culture that's adopting something new will adapt it to fit its own existing values and needs. And he warns against forcing cultural elements onto others, which is often rooted in a belief that one culture is better than another.
And what's philosophically important here is his idea that different types of values, like moral, aesthetic, or religious, can be attached to a whole bunch of different objects or practices. So you could have a moral value attached to a religious ritual or an aesthetic value attached to a social custom. But Locke emphasizes that for new cultural elements to really take root, they need to be adopted or organically forced assimilation, which often comes from a sense of cultural superiority doesn't really work, and it goes against the natural way that cultures evolve.
So through these 3 principles, Locke gives us a really sophisticated way of thinking about cultural diversity that promotes respect, encourages cooperation, and deepens understanding between different cultures. And now let's move on to another major area of his work, his contributions to aesthetics and his role in shaping the artistic scene of the Harlem Renaissance.
This is where Locke's philosophy really comes to life. I mean, he wasn't just a bystander. He was a key figure in this whole movement, both as a theorist and a critic of African-American art, especially through his famous book, The New Negro. And a really important point for us as philosophers is that Locke placed a lot of emphasis on individual artistic expression. And he pushed back against the idea that Black art should mainly be about social or political messages.
This actually put him at odds with people like W.E.B. Du Bois, who strongly believed that Black artists had a duty to uplift their community-challenged stereotypes and fight for equality. Locke, while definitely caring about these social issues, argued that an artist's primary responsibility was to express their own unique vision. He believed that authentic art that comes from a specific cultural experience would naturally speak to universal human themes.
Yeah, Locke was critical of what he saw as a kind of self-imposed limitation on Black art, where it was always reacting to stereotypes and focus on a social agenda. He felt like this was holding Black artists back from exploring a wider range of human experiences and achieving true artistic universality. He saw the New Negro movement as a way to break free from this focus on representation and move towards a more profound and independent form of self-expression.
He describes this shift as moving from portraying the Negro as a formula, like a set of predictable stereotypes, to recognizing Black individuals as complex and fully realized human beings. And he highlights how the Great Migration played a huge role in this evolving sense of identity and artistic expression. It wasn't just about people moving from one place to another. It was a massive cultural and psychological transformation.
Exactly. The Great Migration brought so much internal diversity to the African American community, it basically shattered the idea of a single monolithic Negro identity. And Locke argued that this shared experience of racial oppression was evolving into a more nuanced shared consciousness, a deeper understanding of their own diverse realities. And this new Negro was actively rejecting the segregation that had been imposed on them, both physically and mentally, and breaking down all kinds of barriers, both internal and external.
And he talks about this new group psychology as a shift away from trying to win sympathy from white people and towards a growing sense of self-respect, self-reliance, and racial pride, combined with a desire for objective and honest feedback instead of just pity. And he saw the integration of black art into mainstream American culture as a crucial step towards achieving true democracy.
For Locke, this was nothing short of an experiment in democracy. He believed that a truly democratic society is one where everyone can participate fully and where there's open communication. So the flourishing of black art and its acceptance into the wider American cultural landscape was a major step towards fulfilling those democratic ideals. And he was also really interested in the young Negro artists of the Harlem Renaissance. He felt like their experiences with social pressures and racial prejudice gave their art a special kind of depth and intensity.
And he makes this important distinction between speaking for the Negro and speaking as Negroes, which I think really captures that shift from trying to explain the black experience to a white audience to expressing their own lived truths directly.
Yeah, it's about moving from seeking external validation to embracing internal authenticity. And Locke saw race not as a limiting factor, but as a rich idiom of experience that added layers of complexity and depth to their lives and their art. He also noticed that the younger generation of artists were rejecting the cautious moralism of some earlier black art and embracing art for art's sake, which allowed for a freer and more honest kind of artistic exploration. And this led to some really innovative transformations of traditional folk elements into more technically and stylistically sophisticated art forms.
And of course, we can't talk about Locke's aesthetic philosophy without mentioning his deep appreciation for the Negro spirituals. He saw them as a truly unique and expressive contribution to American art, deeply connected to American history, but with a universal appeal that could reach anyone.
Absolutely. Locke considered the spirituals to be maybe the most characteristic product of the race genius in America, with the potential to become a classic form of folk music. He was really struck by how they survived despite oppression and how they developed from simple folk songs into more structured musical forms.
He saw in them a perfect embodiment of his key artistic principles, the authentic expression of individual and collective experience, the ability to evoke universal emotions, and that transition from traditional folk art to more formally recognized high art. He was a big fan of their emotional power and even suggested that we should categorize spirituals based on the folk activities that inspired them, like prayer songs, work songs, and shouts, instead of just their themes or emotions.
And he was careful to warn against focusing too much on any one element of the spirituals, like just the melody or the harmony or the rhythm. He wanted people to appreciate the whole package, the spirituals as a complex and multifaceted form of cultural and artistic expression. And this naturally leads him to this question of who and what is Negro, especially when it comes to art and cultural identity.
And he completely rejects the idea of a single stereotypical type Negro, pointing out that the African American population is incredibly diverse with a wide range of cultural and social expressions. So when we ask what makes art Negro, is it the artist's race, the themes they explore, or the unique style they use?
Locke leans towards the idea that it's about the skillful and authentic use of Negro idioms and themes, regardless of the artist's own racial background. So it's not just about who made the art, but about the art itself and how deeply it's rooted in a specific cultural and historical context that gives it that Negro character.
This brings us to Locke's philosophy of race, which is still incredibly insightful and way ahead of its time. He was a strong critic of biological determinism and argued that race is primarily a social and cultural construct, not something we're born with.
This is a really fundamental idea in Locke's work. He was really against the idea of fixed biological races, and he was aligned with what has become the dominant view today, which is that race is a social construct. He made a clear distinction between race and culture, saying that while they often overlap and influence each other, there's no automatic connection between them. Your racial classification doesn't determine your culture or your abilities.
But he was also a bit cautious about getting rid of racial categories altogether. He thought they might still be useful as social concepts as long as we use them carefully and avoid harmful stereotypes.
He basically wanted to redefine them. He outlines 3 main ways of thinking about race. the theoretical or scientifically, the political and the social or cultural, and he strongly criticizes the theoretical or scientific view, which says that there are inherent biological differences between races that create a hierarchy. He points out that the science of genetics just doesn't support the way we've socially constructed race. He saw this biological essentialism as a kind of ethnic fiction.
And what about the political view of race? I think that's the idea that race is a product of power dynamics, a system that benefits some groups and disadvantages others.
That's right. Locke saw the political concept of race as basically social inheritance disguised as biological destiny. So racial differences and the inequality that comes with them are the result of historical and ongoing power structures and social systems. And then we have his own view, the social or cultural conception of race, and this is where some of his most original and lasting ideas come in.
This is where he basically says that race is culture, or at least deeply intertwined with it. He saw it as something that's learned and passed down through society, a kind of culture heredity where people conform to a certain culture type, which sounds a lot like the modern idea of social constructionism.
Yeah, does he even suggest that broad racial categories like Negro, Caucasian, and Asian are actually made up of many different social or ethnic races, each with their own unique culture and practices? He saw race as a kind of tradition and a matter of cultural preference within a larger society. So going back to our discussion about the Harlem Renaissance, you have these distinct artistic and cultural expressions within the African American community that are both part of and separate from American culture as a whole.
So racial consciousness, that feeling of shared kinship and awareness of different social practices based on race, isn't inherently bad, but it becomes a problem when it's used to justify systems of domination and oppression. And he saw racist beliefs and practices often based on bad science as tools used by the powerful to stay in control.
And while some people today might say we should just get rid of the concept of race altogether, Locke had a different approach. He called it substitutionism. He believed that the term race and the social realities it tried to describe served a purpose, even if it wasn't perfect. So he wanted to replace the wrong and harmful ways of understanding race with more accurate ones that focused on the social and cultural aspects instead of discredited biological ideas. He basically wanted to get rid of the bad parts of how we think about race, the harmful practices and prejudices that come from thinking that cultural differences are caused by biological inferiority. He saw racial prejudice as this deep-seated psychological problem that's based on misunderstanding human difference.
So for all of you listening who are interested in philosophy, what are some of the key takeaways from Locke's work? I mean, his ideas are really complex and have a lot to offer.
Locke gives us this incredibly sophisticated and still relevant framework for understanding some of the most basic parts of human experience, the nature of value, how culture works, the power of art, and this really complex idea of race. His critical pragmatism gives us these amazing tools for dealing with difference and appreciating the richness of human experience in ways that go beyond simple and often divisive categories, and his insights into the social construction of race, which he developed long before many contemporary thinkers, are still super relevant, and his ideas about the relationship between individual artistic expression and universal human themes are still being discussed today.
And here's the thing to think about. Locke talks a lot about transvaluation, the idea that our emotional attachments to certain concepts or social categories can change over time. So what if we actively engaged in this process of transvaluation? What if we intentionally reevaluated our gut reactions to establish ideas or social structures? Could that open up new ways of thinking philosophically and challenge the norms that we take for granted in ethics, social, and political philosophy, even in how we understand knowledge itself?
And as with many great thinkers, this deep dive has really just scratched the surface of Locke's work. We encourage you to check out his writings, especially his book, The New Negro, and his essay, Values and Imperatives, and see how his ideas connect to contemporary discussions about pragmatism, aesthetics, and critical race theory. Think about how his insights can inform your own philosophical explorations of value identity and the ever-changing nature of culture.